Morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like a shroud, as if nature herself mourned alongside the royal household. Lady Catherine, the fictional duchess inspired by royal dynamics, stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft pastels that seemed too cheerful for such somber days. 3 weeks had passed since the Duke's funeral, and the castle still felt hollow, echoing with memories and unspoken grief. Catherine had learned much about royal life since her marriage 5 years ago, but nothing had prepared her for this. Watching the woman who had been the backbone of the nation for decades struggle with the profound loss of her partner of 73 years. Queen Margaret, the fictional monarch at the center of our story, had always been a figure of unwavering strength. But grief had a way of stripping away even the most carefully constructed facades. The Duchess had observed the Queen during the formal mourning period, noting how she carried herself with the same dignified posture, attended the necessary meetings, and fulfilled her duties with mechanical precision. But Catherine saw what others missed: the slight tremor in the Queen's hands when she thought no one was looking, the way her eyes would lose focus during conversations, and how she would sometimes pause mid-sentence as if remembering something precious and painful. As a former commoner who had married into this extraordinary family, Catherine understood what it felt like to be an outsider trying to find her place. She remembered her own struggles with royal protocol, the loneliness of formal dinners, and the weight of constant scrutiny. But she also remembered the small gestures of kindness that had helped her through the most difficult adjustments. A warm smile during a tense moment, an encouraging word when she stumbled over etiquette, a gentle hand on her shoulder when the pressure felt overwhelming. Now, watching the Queen navigate her grief with the same isolation Catherine had once felt, the Duchess knew she had to act. It wasn't about following protocol or seeking approval from the palace staff, who still sometimes viewed her with skeptical eyes. It was about one human being reaching out to another in their darkest hour. The Queen's private secretary had mentioned that Her Majesty spent most afternoons in the Duke's former study, sitting among his books and personal effects. It was there that Catherine decided to make her approach, not as a duchess following royal duty, but as someone who understood what it meant to feel alone in a room full of people. Catherine made her way through the castle's familiar corridors, past portraits of long-dead monarchs who had faced their own trials and tribulations. The staff moved quietly about their duties, speaking in hushed tones as they had since the Duke's passing. The atmosphere was respectful but heavy, filled with the kind of grief that touches everyone but belongs to one person alone. Outside the study door, Catherine paused. Royal protocol dictated that she should wait for an invitation, should go through proper channels, should announce her intentions through the appropriate staff members. But something deeper than protocol guided her actions as she knocked gently on the heavy oak door. "Come in," came the familiar voice, steady but somehow smaller than usual. Catherine entered to find Queen Margaret sitting in a leather chair beside a mahogany desk covered with papers and personal photographs. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting gentle shadows across the room that had been the Duke's private sanctuary for decades. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines telling the story of a man's intellectual curiosity and varied interests. "Your Majesty," Catherine said softly, offering a respectful curtsy before meeting the Queen's surprised but not unwelcoming gaze. "Catherine, my dear," the Queen replied, setting down a fountain pen she had been holding. "I wasn't expecting visitors this afternoon. I hope I'm not intruding," Catherine said, her voice carrying genuine concern. "I wanted to see how you were managing, away from all the formal check-ins and official duties." The Queen's expression softened slightly, a crack appearing in the composed mask she had worn for weeks. "That's very thoughtful of you. Please, sit down." As Catherine settled into a chair across from the Queen, she noticed the scattered photographs on the desk, images spanning decades of marriage, from formal state portraits to candid moments captured during private holidays. One photo showed the Queen and Duke laughing together at what appeared to be a family barbecue, their faces relaxed and genuinely happy. "He would have liked this room to be used," the Queen said, following Catherine's gaze. "He always said books were meant to be read, not displayed. These papers, though, I'm not quite sure what to do with all of this." Catherine could see the overwhelm in the Queen's gesture toward the desk. "Would you like some help sorting through them? Sometimes having another pair of hands can make these tasks feel less daunting." For a moment, the Queen looked genuinely surprised by the offer. In her world, personal tasks were usually handled by staff members following careful protocols. The idea of someone simply offering to help, without ceremony or procedure, seemed to catch her off guard. "That's very kind, but surely you have other obligations this afternoon?" "Nothing that can't wait," Catherine replied honestly. "Sometimes the most important things aren't in our official schedules." The Queen studied Catherine's face, perhaps recognizing something authentic in her offer. "He kept everything," she said finally, a small smile touching her lips. "Every letter, every program from events we attended, even receipts from restaurants we visited during our early courtship. I used to tease him about being a pack rat." "It sounds like he treasured memories," Catherine said gently. "That's not pack ratting, that's love." Something shifted in the Queen's expression, a softening that hadn't been present during any of the formal condolence meetings or official ceremonies. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I suppose it was." As the afternoon progressed, the two women began the delicate task of sorting through decades of accumulated memories. Catherine followed the Queen's lead, listening to stories that emerged as they uncovered forgotten treasures, ticket stubs from a theater performance during their engagement, handwritten notes the Duke had left for the Queen during official tours, photographs from family holidays where royal formality gave way to genuine relaxation. With each discovered item, the Queen seemed to breathe a little easier, as if sharing these memories made them more real rather than more painful. Catherine offered gentle comments and questions, never pushing, but always ready to listen when the Queen wanted to share. "He wrote me letters," the Queen said suddenly, holding up a small bundle tied with ribbon. "Even when we were both living in the palace, he would write me letters. Little observations about his day, jokes he thought would make me laugh, sometimes just reminders of how much he loved me." Catherine felt her heart tighten with emotion. What a beautiful tradition. He sounds like he was a wonderful romantic. People didn't always see that side of him, the Queen replied, carefully untying the ribbon. The public image was quite different: duty, service, formality. But here, in private, he was just a man who loved his wife very much. As the sun began to set outside the tall windows, casting golden light across the study, Catherine realized that something important had happened during their afternoon together. The Queen's posture had relaxed, her voice had regained some of its natural warmth, and the terrible isolation that had surrounded her seemed to have lifted, even if just temporarily. "Thank you," the Queen said as Catherine prepared to leave. "I hadn't realized how much I needed to talk about him, not as the Duke, but as the man I married all those years ago." "He'll always be both," Catherine replied softly. "The public figure they honored and the private man you loved. Neither version diminishes the other." As Catherine made her way back through the castle corridors, she reflected on the afternoon's unexpected intimacy. She had come to offer comfort, but had received something equally valuable: a deeper understanding of the woman behind the crown and a recognition that grief, like love, transcends all social boundaries. That evening, as she lay in bed beside her husband, Catherine thought about the bundle of letters the Queen had held so carefully. Tomorrow, she decided, she would return to the study. Not because protocol demanded it, but because genuine friendship required nothing more than showing up, again and again, until the weight of grief became something that could be shared rather than carried alone. The castle settled into its nighttime quiet, but in the Duke's former study, a small light remained on as Queen Margaret read through letters that reminded her not just of loss, but of a love so profound that not even death could diminish its impact on her life. Part 2. The next morning brought gray clouds and a persistent drizzle that matched the mood hanging over the royal household. Catherine had awakened with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. Her conversation with Queen Margaret the previous day had revealed not just the depth of the monarch's grief, but also her profound isolation in processing it. Royal grief, Catherine had learned, was particularly complex. While the nation mourned the Duke publicly, with tributes and ceremonies and collective remembrance, the Queen was expected to embody both personal loss and national stability simultaneously. She had to be the grieving widow and the unchanging monarch, vulnerable enough to be human but strong enough to lead. Catherine understood this duality in her own way. Since joining the royal family, she had learned to navigate the space between her private self and her public role, though never in circumstances as challenging as these. Her own struggles with media scrutiny, public criticism, and the pressure to conform to centuries-old expectations had taught her something valuable about resilience, and about the importance of having someone who saw you as a person rather than a position. After breakfast, Catherine made her way to Queen Margaret's private secretary to inquire about the monarch's schedule. Lady Patricia, a stern woman in her 60s who had served the royal household for over 30 years, looked up from her papers with barely concealed disapproval. Her Majesty has meetings with the private secretary, then a briefing on Commonwealth matters, followed by the weekly audience with the Prime Minister, Lady Patricia recited in clipped tones. I'm quite certain there's no time for informal visits. Catherine recognized the protective instinct behind the secretary's efficiency, but she also sensed something else, a worry that mirrored her own about the Queen's emotional state. Has she been eating properly? Catherine asked quietly. Lady Patricia's expression flickered, revealing a moment of genuine concern. She's been distracted during meals. Often leaves food untouched. Claims she's not hungry, but she trailed off, clearly struggling with speaking so candidly about the Queen's personal habits. Perhaps I could arrange for some of her favorite tea to be served in the study this afternoon, Catherine suggested. Something informal, nothing that would interfere with her official duties. For a moment, Lady Patricia seemed to wrestle with protocol versus practicality. Finally, she nodded slightly. Earl Grey. She's always preferred Earl Grey in the afternoons. With honey, not sugar. Catherine smiled, recognizing the secretary's small act of rebellion against the formal barriers that sometimes prevented genuine care. Earl Grey with honey. I'll remember that. That afternoon, Catherine arrived at the study carrying a tea tray herself, a breach of protocol that would have shocked the household staff. But she had learned that sometimes the most meaningful gestures came from setting aside rules in favor of human connection. She found Queen Margaret exactly where she had been the day before, surrounded by papers and photographs, but this time she seemed more lost than purposeful. The monarch looked up as Catherine entered, and, for a moment, her composed mask slipped entirely, revealing exhaustion and confusion. I can't seem to make sense of any of this, the Queen said, gesturing helplessly at the scattered documents. Yesterday it felt manageable, but today, she shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. Catherine set down the tea tray and poured 2 cups, adding honey to both. Grief isn't linear, she said gently, offering a cup to the Queen. Some days feel clearer than others. That's not a failing, it's human. Queen Margaret accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup as if drawing comfort from its heat. I keep thinking I should be handling this better. I've dealt with loss before, faced difficult times. But this, she paused, her voice catching slightly. This feels different. Because it is different, Catherine replied, settling into her chair from the previous day. This isn't just loss. It's the reshaping of everything you've known for 73 years. Your daily routines, your partnership in leading the nation, even the simple comfort of having someone to share observations with at the end of each day. The Queen looked at Catherine with surprise, as if no one had quite articulated her experience so precisely. Yes, she said softly. Yes, that's exactly what it is. We shared everything. The weight of decisions, the small moments of humor during formal events, even our thoughts about people we met. I find myself wanting to tell him things, and then, remembering. Catherine watched as the Queen's composure wavered again, and she made a decision that would have scandalized the royal household. She reached across the small space between their chairs and gently placed her hand over the Queen's. For a moment, Queen Margaret looked down at their joined hands in astonishment. Physical comfort was rarely part of royal interactions, formal handshakes, ceremonial gestures, but not the simple human touch of one person comforting another. Yet something in that contact seemed to anchor her, allowing her to continue speaking. The hardest part is the silence, the Queen admitted. Not just his absence, but the way everyone around me is trying so hard to be appropriate, to give me space, to respect my grief. But sometimes I don't want respectful distance. Sometimes I want someone to remember him with me, to laugh about his quirks or share a story that brings him back to life, just for a moment. Catherine squeezed the Queen's hand gently. Tell me about something that made you laugh. Something only you would know about him. Queen Margaret's eyes lit up with a spark of the warmth Catherine had glimpsed the day before. He talked to his plants, she said, a small smile breaking through her sadness. In the greenhouse at Sandringham, he would have entire conversations with them. Serious discussions about their growth, gentle scolding if they weren't thriving, even jokes he thought they might appreciate. Did it work? Catherine asked, genuinely curious. Remarkably well, the Queen replied, her smile growing. His gardens were always the most successful. He claimed it was scientific, that talking to plants provided them with carbon dioxide and encouraged growth. But I think they responded to the affection in his voice. That's beautiful, Catherine said. It says so much about who he was beneath all the formal duties. He was endlessly curious, the Queen continued, her voice gaining strength as she shared these private memories. Always reading, always asking questions. During state dinners, he would research obscure facts about our guests' countries and surprise them with his knowledge. They expected polite conversation, but he would engage them in discussions about their local wildlife or architectural traditions. As the afternoon progressed, the Queen shared story after story, moments of humor, instances of unexpected kindness, examples of the Duke's ability to find wonder in small things despite the weight of his official responsibilities. With each memory, she seemed to reclaim a piece of herself that grief had temporarily obscured. Catherine listened actively, asking questions that drew out more details, sharing her own observations about the Duke's character from the few interactions she had witnessed. She was careful not to claim more knowledge than she possessed, but she offered genuine appreciation for the man the Queen was describing. You know, the Queen said as the light outside began to fade. I haven't spoken about him like this since the funeral. Everyone wants to discuss his legacy, his service to the nation, his official contributions. All of that matters, of course, but sometimes I just want to remember the man who made terrible jokes at breakfast and insisted on doing crossword puzzles in pen. Those memories are just as important, Catherine assured her. They're what made your partnership unique, what sustained you through decades of public service. Protecting those private moments doesn't diminish his public legacy, it enriches it. As Catherine prepared to leave, the Queen stood and moved to one of the tall windows overlooking the castle gardens. He planned those flower beds, she said quietly. Spent hours designing the layout, choosing varieties that would bloom in sequence throughout the growing season. He wanted to ensure there would always be something beautiful to see from this window. Catherine joined her at the window, looking out at the carefully tended gardens that would soon burst into spring color. He gave you a living gift, she said softly. Something that will grow and change and surprise you, year after year. I hadn't thought of it that way, the Queen replied, her voice filled with something approaching peace. A gift that keeps giving long after. They stood together in comfortable silence, two women from different worlds united by their understanding of love, loss, and the courage required to continue living fully after grief changes everything. When Catherine finally took her leave, the Queen's gratitude was evident not just in her words, but in the way she carried herself, less burdened, more present, as if sharing her memories had transformed them from painful reminders into precious treasures that could be safely examined and cherished. That evening, Catherine reflected on how authentic human connection could transcend any protocol or procedure. In reaching out to comfort someone else, she had discovered something profound about the healing power of simply being present with another person's pain, without trying to fix it or rush it, but simply witnessing it with love and respect. Part 3. A week had passed since Catherine began her informal visits to Queen Margaret, and something beautiful was beginning to emerge from their unlikely friendship. What had started as compassionate outreach was developing into a genuine bond that surprised them both with its depth and authenticity. The palace staff had begun to notice subtle changes in the Queen's demeanor. Lady Patricia mentioned to Catherine that Her Majesty had begun eating more regularly, and had even smiled during a briefing about upcoming state visits. The household staff whispered among themselves about the Queen's improved spirits, though none could quite pinpoint the source of the change. Catherine had learned to read the rhythms of the Queen's grief, understanding that some days were harder than others, and that healing wasn't a straight line toward recovery, but rather a complex dance between remembrance and acceptance. She had begun bringing small tokens to their afternoon visits. A book of poetry she thought the Queen might enjoy, wildflowers from the castle gardens, or simply a new blend of tea to try together. On this particular afternoon, Catherine arrived at the study to find Queen Margaret standing before a large portrait of the Duke that hung above the fireplace. The painting showed him in his naval uniform, young and confident, with eyes that seemed to hold both mischief and determination. He was so handsome, the Queen said without turning around. But it wasn't his looks that captured my heart. It was his irreverence. He treated me like a woman, not a symbol. In a world where everyone bowed and curtsied, he would wink at me during formal ceremonies or whisper terrible jokes during state dinners. Catherine smiled, imagining the young couple navigating the complexities of royal romance, while the world watched their every move. That must have been both wonderful and terrifying, finding love under such intense scrutiny. The scrutiny was difficult, Queen Margaret admitted, finally, turning from the portrait to face Catherine. But finding someone who saw past the crown, who loved the person beneath the title, that made everything else bearable. As they settled into their usual chairs with fresh tea, Catherine noticed that the Queen had been writing. Several pages of elegant handwriting lay scattered across the desk, covered in the distinctive blue ink of her fountain pen. Letters? Catherine asked gently, not wanting to intrude on something private. Queen Margaret glanced at the papers with slight embarrassment. I've been writing to him, she admitted. I know how it sounds, but I find myself wanting to share things with him. Observations about the day, concerns about family matters, even silly thoughts about the weather. Writing them down makes it feel less like talking to myself. Catherine felt her heart swell with understanding. That doesn't sound silly at all. It sounds like love finding a way to continue expressing itself, even when the usual channels have changed. Do you think it's healthy? The Queen asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. Sometimes I worry that I'm not processing his loss properly, that I'm holding on to something I should be learning to release. Catherine considered the question carefully, drawing from her own understanding of love and loss, though nothing in her experience compared to the depth of the Queen's situation. I think love that deep doesn't simply disappear because someone dies, she said finally. It finds new ways to exist, new forms of expression. Writing to him might be exactly what you need right now. The Queen's relief was visible, as if she had been carrying worry about her own coping mechanisms along with her grief. He would probably find it amusing, she said, picking up one of the letters. He always teased me about my formal writing style. Even in personal notes, I tend toward proper grammar and complete sentences. What would he say if he could read them? Catherine asked. Queen Margaret laughed, the first genuine laugh Catherine had heard from her in weeks. He would probably suggest I use more contractions and fewer dependent clauses. He always said I wrote like I was addressing Parliament, even when I was just leaving him a note about dinner plans. The conversation drifted to other memories, each one bringing the Queen a little further back to herself. Catherine marveled at how sharing grief could transform it from an isolating burden into something more manageable, not less painful, but somehow less overwhelming. As they talked, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. Lady Patricia entered with a slight frown of concern. Your Majesty, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Prince William is here for your scheduled discussion about the upcoming memorial service planning. Catherine immediately began to rise, recognizing her cue to leave, but Queen Margaret gestured for her to remain seated. Actually, Patricia, would you ask William to join us here? I think it would be helpful to have Catherine's perspective on some of these matters. Lady Patricia's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, but she nodded and withdrew. A few moments later, Prince William entered the study, his expression shifting from formal concern to genuine surprise as he noticed the relaxed atmosphere and his grandmother's improved demeanor. Grandmother, he said warmly, crossing to kiss her cheek. You look well. And, Catherine, lovely to see you. William, dear, the Queen replied, her voice carrying more energy than it had in weeks. "We were just discussing how your grandfather would have wanted us to handle some of the memorial arrangements. I thought you might appreciate hearing some of the stories Catherine and I have been sharing." What followed was an afternoon that none of them had expected. Instead of a formal planning session, they found themselves engaged in a rich conversation about memory, legacy, and the challenge of honoring someone's life while allowing for genuine grieving. William shared his own struggles with processing his grandfather's death, particularly the weight of public expectation during private mourning. Catherine offered insights from her unique position as someone who had observed the family dynamics while maintaining emotional distance from childhood attachments. "Grandfather would have hated anything too somber," William said at one point. "He always preferred celebration to solemnity. Even during serious state occasions, he found ways to inject subtle humor or humanity into the proceedings." "That's exactly what I've been thinking," the Queen replied, her eyes bright with engagement. "But I wasn't sure how to suggest a less traditional approach without seeming disrespectful to protocol." Catherine listened to the grandmother and grandson work through their ideas, occasionally offering gentle questions or observations that helped them clarify their thoughts. She was struck by how much more naturally the conversation flowed when it focused on the Duke's actual character rather than abstract concepts of duty or tradition. "What if we included some of his favorite music?" Catherine suggested during a pause. "Not just hymns or classical pieces, but songs that actually meant something to him personally." William's face lit up. He loved jazz, used to play records in his private study and drive the staff slightly mad with it. And he adored that ridiculous song about being lovely to look at, the Queen added, laughing at the memory. He would hum it while getting dressed for formal events, claiming it improved his mood for ceremonies. As the afternoon progressed, what had begun as a duty-driven meeting transformed into something more meaningful, a collaborative effort to create a memorial that honored both the public figure and the private man they had all loved in different ways. By the time William prepared to leave, the Queen seemed more animated and purposeful than she had since the Duke's death. She walked him to the door with renewed energy, discussing follow-up plans and additional family members who should be consulted. "Thank you," William said quietly to Catherine as the Queen gathered some papers. "I don't know what you've been doing during these visits, but she's more herself than she's been in weeks." Catherine smiled, understanding that she had witnessed something special, not just the Queen's gradual emergence from the darkest phase of her grief, but the beautiful way that shared love could become a foundation for healing rather than just a source of pain. After William left, the Queen settled back into her chair with a thoughtful expression. "That felt good," she said simply. "Planning something he would have enjoyed, rather than something that meets everyone else's expectations of proper mourning." "It sounds like you're finding your way back to yourself," Catherine observed gently. "With considerable help," the Queen replied, meeting Catherine's eyes with genuine warmth. "I'm not sure I would have found my footing so well without these conversations. You've given me something invaluable, permission to grieve as a woman, not just as a monarch." As Catherine made her way home that evening, she reflected on the unexpected gift she had received through this experience. In reaching out to offer comfort, she had discovered the profound satisfaction of authentic connection across the usual boundaries of protocol and position. She had also learned something important about resilience, that it often comes not from individual strength, but from the courage to accept support when it's offered with genuine love. Part 4. 3 months had passed since the Duke's funeral, and the relationship between Catherine and Queen Margaret had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. What began as compassionate support during acute grief had developed into a genuine friendship that enriched both their lives in unexpected ways. The Queen had indeed begun to emerge from the darkest period of her mourning, but not in the way palace officials had expected. Rather than simply returning to her previous routine, she seemed to be discovering new aspects of herself that had been dormant during her decades of partnership. Catherine had become both witness to and catalyst for this transformation. Their afternoon visits had become a cherished ritual, no longer focused primarily on managing grief, but on exploring interests and ideas that energized the Queen. They had begun reading books together, sometimes poetry that the Duke had enjoyed, other times contemporary novels that offered fresh perspectives on modern life. Catherine brought stories from outside the palace walls, sharing observations about ordinary people living ordinary lives that fascinated a woman who had spent her entire adult life in extraordinary circumstances. "I've been thinking about legacy," the Queen said during one of their recent conversations, looking up from a memoir they had been discussing. "Not the official legacy, the constitutional changes, the modernization efforts, the state visits, and ceremonies. I mean personal legacy. What I want to leave behind that's uniquely mine." Catherine set down her teacup, recognizing the weight of the question. "What feels most important to you when you think about it that way?" "Authenticity," the Queen replied without hesitation. "For 70 years, I've balanced personal desires with public duty, often sublimating my own preferences for the greater good. That was necessary, and I don't regret it. But now, in whatever time I have remaining, I want to be more fully myself." This conversation would prove to be pivotal, leading to decisions that would surprise the royal establishment and delight the public in equal measure. The first sign of the Queen's new direction came during a scheduled visit to a children's hospital. Traditionally, these appearances followed strict protocols: brief conversations with selected patients, photo opportunities with medical staff, formal presentations of charitable donations. But this time, something different happened. Catherine had accompanied the Queen on the visit, ostensibly in her official capacity, but really because their friendship had made such appearances more enjoyable for both of them. As they toured the pediatric wing, they encountered a young girl named Emma who was recovering from surgery and clearly nervous about meeting royalty. Instead of the usual formal exchange, the Queen surprised everyone by sitting on the edge of Emma's hospital bed and asking about the book the child was reading. When Emma mentioned she was struggling with a particular chapter, the Queen offered to read aloud, and spent the next 20 minutes doing exactly that, using different voices for different characters and making Emma laugh with her theatrical interpretations. The image of the Queen perched on a hospital bed, reading a children's book with genuine enthusiasm, became one of the most beloved photographs of her entire reign. But, more importantly, it marked the beginning of a new phase in her public life, one characterized by spontaneity, warmth, and the kind of authentic human connection she had discovered in her friendship with Catherine. "Did you see the headlines?" Catherine asked during their next visit, showing the Queen a collection of newspaper clippings that had accumulated over the past week. "Queen shows her human side," the Queen read aloud, then laughed. "As if I haven't been human all along. Though I suppose I understand what they mean. I have been rather formal in my public interactions. How does it feel, seeing such positive reactions to you being more yourself?" Catherine asked. "Liberating," the Queen admitted, "and slightly terrifying. For decades, I've maintained careful control over my public image, ensuring it met constitutional requirements and public expectations. This feels like stepping into uncharted territory. But you're not abandoning your role," Catherine pointed out. "You're fulfilling it more completely by bringing more of yourself to it." This insight would guide the Queen's approach over the coming months. Rather than viewing authenticity and duty as opposing forces, she began to see them as complementary aspects of effective leadership. The changes became more evident in subsequent public appearances. The Queen began including personal anecdotes in her speeches, sharing stories that illustrated points rather than simply stating facts. During garden parties, she spent longer in conversation with individual guests, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in their lives and work. Most notably, she began incorporating references to the Duke in more natural ways during public events. Instead of maintaining formal silence about her loss, she would mention something he had told her about the organization she was visiting, or share a relevant story from their shared experiences. These references weren't maudlin or excessive. They were organic acknowledgments of a partnership that had shaped her perspective and continued to influence her decisions. People seemed to appreciate hearing about him. Catherine observed after watching clips from a recent state dinner where the Queen had shared a humorous anecdote about the Duke's reaction to a particular diplomatic protocol. "It feels right," the Queen replied. "He was such an integral part of my reign, my decision-making, my understanding of the world. Pretending that influence disappeared with his death wouldn't be honest or helpful." The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Rather than viewing the Queen's more personal approach as weakness or departure from tradition, people seemed to find it refreshing and relatable. Letters poured into the palace expressing appreciation for her authenticity and sharing personal stories of loss and resilience that resonated with her experience. One afternoon, as they sat in the study that had become their favorite meeting place, the Queen showed Catherine a particularly moving letter from a widow in Scotland who had lost her husband after 52 years of marriage. She writes about feeling invisible after his death, the Queen said, her voice soft with emotion, about how people who had known them as a couple didn't know how to interact with her alone. She says seeing me continue to reference him publicly has given her courage to do the same, to honor their relationship rather than hiding it to make others comfortable. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she read the letter. You're giving people permission to love openly, even in loss. That's a remarkable gift. It's what you gave me, the Queen replied simply. In those early days, when you encouraged me to share memories rather than suppress them, when you made it clear that talking about him brought him closer rather than making his absence more painful, that changed everything for me. As summer approached, the Queen made another decision that surprised the royal household. She announced her intention to open the Duke's private gardens to the public for the first time, sharing the living legacy he had created with people who had admired him from afar. He would have loved showing people his flowers, she explained to Catherine as they walked through the gardens together, planning the logistics of the public openings. He was always prouder of a successful rose bush than a successful state dinner. The garden openings became incredibly popular, with visitors moved not just by the beauty of the landscaping but by the Queen's personal tours, during which she shared stories about the Duke's gardening philosophy and their shared enjoyment of the outdoor spaces. Catherine often joined these tours, marveling at how naturally the Queen had grown into this more open version of herself. The formal monarch was still present when required, but she no longer felt the need to maintain that persona in every public interaction. You know, the Queen said as they paused beside a particularly spectacular bed of roses, I think he would be pleased with how this has all unfolded. Not just the public response, but my own growth. He always encouraged me to trust my instincts more, to worry less about perfect propriety, and more about genuine connection. It sounds like you're living the advice he would have given you, Catherine replied, touched by the integration of love and wisdom that characterized the Queen's current approach to life. With considerable help from a very good friend, the Queen added, squeezing Catherine's arm affectionately. As they continued their walk through the gardens that had become a symbol of enduring love and careful cultivation, both women reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun in grief had blossomed into something beautiful, not just personal healing, but a transformation that had touched countless lives and redefined what it meant to serve with both duty and authenticity. Part 5 as autumn painted the castle grounds in brilliant shades of gold and amber, Queen Margaret and Catherine found themselves reflecting on a year that had transformed them both in ways they couldn't have imagined. The acute phase of grief had given way to something more complex, but ultimately more sustainable, an integration of loss that allowed room for continued growth, joy, and purpose. The Queen's evolution had not gone unnoticed by her family, her staff, or the public. The woman who had once maintained strict emotional boundaries in all her interactions now moved through the world with a warmth and accessibility that felt both natural and revolutionary. Catherine had been privileged to witness this transformation from its earliest moments, and she had learned as much about resilience and authenticity as she had given in support. Their friendship had also begun to influence Catherine's own approach to her royal role. Watching the Queen navigate the balance between tradition and innovation, duty and personal expression, had given Catherine a model for how to honor both her responsibilities and her authentic self. Then, the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where centuries of tradition echo through marble corridors, an unexpected friendship bloomed between two women from vastly different worlds. When grief threatened to shatter the very foundations of the monarchy, it would be the newest member of the family, once an outsider, now an insider, who would offer the kind of comfort that no royal protocol could ever prescribe. This is the story of how genuine human connection transcended titles, traditions, and the weight of a thousand-year-old crown.